Hey, thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus. It is August, and that means, of course, it's back to school for a lot of kids. And I guess for parents, it's going to adjust your schedules as well. So we want to get you a few kind of health safety tips as we head back to school. And for that, we're joined by 9 News health expert, Dr. Payal Kohli, for some of those helpful tips as we head back to school. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
Hi, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm good. I had COVID last month, as you know, but a lot better now, and obviously not feeling those impacts. But Dr. Kohli, with a lot of kids going back to school now, obviously that's top of mind for a lot of parents out there as well. What are those kind of top line takeaways or things that parents and kids should know as they head back to school?
You know, I'm feeling a lot better this year, Chris, about our kids going back to school, because this is the first year that we have kids of all ages eligible for the vaccines. So now we have a really good preventive measure in place as our kids are headed back to school. Now, of course, we do have to keep in mind that it's not just COVID, but colds, flus, and potentially even monkeypox, which we have seen in children, that are all viruses that could potentially affect our kids this year as they go back to school. So I think education is going to be a key piece of this, sort of making sure that you're aware of what your school's policies are with respect to all of these parameters, vaccination, hand hygiene, education of the kids, and then really just figuring out a plan for yourself and your family to keep your kids as safe as possible.
I guess before we get into some of those specifics about what to do, this is now year 3 that a school year is being directly impacted by COVID, and this is admittedly a very general question. How has COVID evolved here through the years in terms of how it impacts children?
You know, I think the biggest impacts we saw were really in the first year and the second year. Probably peaked in the second year with respect to mental health disorders and substance abuse. And now, given that, 40% of Americans are saying that they've sort of gone back to their pre-pandemic routines, we are starting to see, thankfully, some of those mental effects at least start to abate. Now, in terms of the physical effects, whether it comes to adults or kids, a lot of things were missed during the pandemic in terms of preventive health visits, in terms of vaccinations. And there's even some theories that because many of us have not had the flu over the last couple of years, that subsequent flu seasons may actually end up being potentially a little bit more severe because we really haven't had that protection from the year before. So it remains to be seen how it's going to play out. I would say we're starting to be at least on the downslope in terms of some of the health effects of the pandemic because many of our routines have gone back to normal. Now, moving forward, going into the fall and winter, we're really going to still have to keep our guard up because we know that there's new variants that are still looming on the horizon.
Well, speaking of those new variants, how has the risk for kids perhaps contracting the virus and then perhaps bringing it back to their parents, has that risk increased in the last few years with Omicron?
Well, we know Omicron's more transmissible and more contagious, but we also know that as we're vaccinating some of our kids, there's some cross-protection with, even though it's original variant vaccine that we're giving to our kids with respect to transmitting Omicron. We also know at this point that the majority of us in America are immune, either through vaccination or through infection, or for many of us actually both, such as yourself. So that really does actually offer another layer of protection for the parents and also for the kids themselves too, because the parents can't give it to the kids as efficiently. So on the background of all of this is why the CDC has really decided, I think, to start to loosen up some of those back to school guidelines and change the way that kids are mixing in school, very different from what we were doing last year.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit. So those new CDC guidelines, specifically what are they and how are they going to affect kids and parents? So
kids no longer have to stay 6 feet apart. And so that's a big one. If you are exposed to somebody as a child who tests positive, it used to be what's called a test to stay strategy, that you actually have to test negative repeatedly in order to come back to class. They've kind of taken that away if the child is asymptomatic. They've also taken away something called cohorting, which was really keeping kids in little pods so that they can do some of that contact tracing, because they're now saying that contact tracing should only be reserved for high-risk settings like prisons or nursing homes and such, not necessarily be done in the school. And then they're also saying you can come back to school in 5 days if you test positive, as long as your symptoms are getting better and you have that mask on.
And now, with some of those new guidelines in mind, how can parents keep their kids safer through the fall and winter?
Yeah, so my nephew's going to kindergarten for the first time, and
Oh.
yeah, he's really excited about it, and I am so glad that he got the vaccine, because I think one of the biggest things that we can do with respect to COVID in particular, of course, is to get our children vaccinated, and we now have 2 good vaccines. The Moderna vaccine does give immunity a little faster. You're, immune within about 5 weeks, 6 weeks, excuse me, as opposed to the Pfizer vaccine, which takes about 11 weeks for your kids below 5 to get immune, whereas for the kids over 5, it's only a 2-dose vaccine. So get our kids vaccinated. I think that's a big piece of it, whether they're at home or they're going to school, if they're eligible for the vaccine. But I also think there's some other kind of healthy behaviors that we really have to permeate into our kids, some of the hand hygiene that we've talked about. But I like to think about sort of 3 domains of health when it comes to our kids. There's their mental health, there's their physical health, and then there's their emotional health or their personality development. So I really want all parents, as their kids are heading back to school, to sort of think about damage control from what's already happened, and then how we can optimize all those 3 parameters for our kids moving forward.
Aside from COVID, what other things can we do to keep our kids healthy into the fall and winter?
Yeah, so I think a big piece of that is, obviously the physical health, which I would say is eating right. So make sure your child has breakfast, because there's actually data that children who eat breakfast, or sometimes even the kids that participate in those school breakfast programs, they actually do better academically than the ones that don't. So breakfast really is the most important meal of the day. Make sure, even though you're obviously very rushed and pressed for time, that you're giving them healthy snacks. So try to keep our kids away from those processed foods, things that come out of bags or boxes, and you really want to try to lean towards more fruits and vegetables and those types of snacks for our kids, because we know that childhood obesity is on the rise, and we know that that's becoming more of an issue. We want to make sure that they're staying active. So when they come home after school, some activity that makes them get off the couch and do something active rather than screen time or computer time or some of the other things that maybe during the pandemic they got potentially, in the habit of doing. And then the last piece of that is sleep. So there's actually data that 40 to 60% of middle to high school students are not getting enough sleep every night. And we know that doesn't just affect their academic performance, it actually can affect their growth, it can affect their mental development, it can affect them psychologically in terms of anxiety and depression. So really try to get those kids into a sleep routine, because summer's over and it's now time to go back to school. So make sure that they're getting those correct number of sleep that they need.
Is the amount of that a middle schooler, elementary schooler should sleep, is that comparable to adults? Is it 8 hours?
No, it's actually a little different. So it's you want to sleep 9 to 10 hours if you're under the age of 13, and if you're over the age of 13, you want to sleep at least 8 to 9 hours. So as you get older, until we become adults, the amount of sleep you require goes down, and then actually as we become older adults, we can see that start to go back up again. And people need naps, and people might need a little bit more sleep as they potentially become even older, geriatric aged.
I'm going to look into the camera here and make an appeal to my bosses here at 9 News. I need a daily nap every day here, and Dr. Kohli signs off on it. But seriously, Dr. Kohli.
Is that what I said?
I'm going to just take what you said there and expand on it.
Yes.
But on a serious note, some really great tips for kids and for parents. So thank you so much, Dr. Kohli, and thanks for joining us here on 9 News Plus today.
My pleasure, Chris.